Hey there folks! So recently I poked into a quaint little title, specifically Possum House Studios' odd puzzle platformer Shot in the Dark. Now, while it was a bit of a mixed experience, it did leave me curious to other titles the dev had done, and with the Steam sale around the corner / probably already passed by the time this video's out, I knew what I had to do. So today I'm going to be covering another Possum House game, this one being their puzzle platformer, The Sword and the Slime. Join me as I make a pointed effort to cleave through its content and see if it left me feeling all gooey inside by the end of it. I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. The fairy kingdom's under attack. An army of orcs headed by a massive ogre have begun to make a general mess of things, and it falls on you to save the day. Mostly by waking up the nearest enchanted sword and letting it do all the work. Well, maybe not all the work, seeing as you find yourself adopting a gelatinous cube along the way. Yup, just an epic quest with you and your flesh-eating slime monster. So, yeah. No, The Sword and the Slime doesn't really take itself all that seriously, and it's honestly fine. While the story is fairly brief and to the point, I still found the overall journey to be fairly charming, and found myself looking forward to the brief smatterings of NPC dialogue that I came across. That said, the real meat of the experience came in the form of its gameplay. See, this is a bit of an odd duck as far as a platforming puzzler goes, especially given the way it introduces its mechanics. Initially, you're simply placed in charge of the sword, which you can helpfully guide around the map with your mouse. And honestly, it's a pretty efficient engine of destruction, as the enemies have very little it can do to stop you, as even blocking your swing only momentarily inconveniences you. The environment, on the other hand, well, turns out magical swords are deathly allergic to the dark, and whether it's prolonged contact with ambient gloom, or a sudden encounter with a dark spell or malicious fae, the sword just be momentarily disenchanted. Or not so momentarily if it lands in a dark area. At that point, you're only left with one option: to reset the stage. This nuance actually forms the central element of the game's challenge. It only grows more complicated once you pick up your gelatinous companion. For one thing, while you're suddenly controlling a party, both characters are still tied to the mouse. The cube is just limited to sliding at a slower pace or slightly hopping after the cursor, which can make navigating platforming segments a bit of a challenge, especially once you factor in that the relative threat of the obstacles you encounter is suddenly amplified. Now, not only can they knock you astray and potentially send the slime spiraling down to a pit or to the start of a puzzle, they can also just outright murder the slime, which also ends the level, though to the slime's credit, not all at once. See, the slime is thankfully pretty resilient and can actually eat things, especially enemies, to get larger, which also lets him tank hits when you mess up, or to weigh down push plates, barring your way. That said, there's also times when you need to intentionally cut your cube down to size in order to advance through tight passages, which can make lengthier stages feel harrowing due to your whittled down status. More so, in fact, once you get to stages where your potentially fragile cube becomes your central light source, since this obliges you to stay close and risk friendly fire even as you're swiping away oncoming arrows or angry arachnids. Overall, The Sword and the Slime definitely provides novel challenges as you progress through the stages, and even incorporated what I felt was a surprisingly chill take on a set of auto-scroller levels. And it's not just the gameplay I found charming, either. I overall enjoyed the game's soundtrack a fair bit, with the various themes helping to make my journey a bit more memorable. Admittedly, I wasn't quite as keen on the sound effects, especially when I got sword swipe happy. And as for the visuals, it's a pretty fun romp. The stages are nice to drift through, though you might get a little bit of repetition. There is something satisfying, though, about gibbing a monster with the sword and then plucking through a wave of others with the cube and watching them dissolve. And I also just appreciated the smaller touches, like the visual cue when the sword was going to power down from being in darkness. That was just really helpful. Still, there's some details I've been expressly reserving for the conclusion. For one thing, Sword and the Slime is short. Like, I poked through the game in a little bit under an hour, 52 minutes. And there really isn't much in the way of replayability once you've sauntered through. Like, yes, there is a chapter select if you're so inclined, but I couldn't actually fathom a reason to use it by game's end. That's not to say I didn't have a good time. Like I said, it manages to provide a decent combination of variety, challenge, alongside its novel movement mechanics. Enough that I can even call it a pretty solid gameplay experience. That said, I'll admit that I was pretty grateful I bought this during the Steam sale, given just how brief the overall experience was. So, while I can tentatively call it a hit, at least in regards to how it plays out, I definitely felt the need to add the stipulation, just given how quick I tore through it. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, you can check out my Twitch over at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. So, with all that out of the way, I'll catch you folks on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then.